Spotlight is a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. It seeks to spotlight people, places, and events from around the Diocese of Youngstown that promote the new gospel of joy called for by Pope Francis. Your program host is Father James Korda.
Hello and welcome to Spotlight. I'm Father Jim Korda. During this series, we're going to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Diocese of Youngstown. And joining me in today's show is Rick Krivanka, who is the Executive Director of the Jesuit Retreat House in Cleveland. Rick, it's a pleasure to have you on the show today.
That's a great honor to be here, Jim.
You know, I've known you for many years, and you have been part of the Cleveland Diocese, our parent diocese, for a number of years. And I'd like us to begin talking about that relationship of Cleveland and Youngstown. You know, it's interesting because when Youngstown became a diocese, we no longer seem to have a relationship with Cleveland for a number of years, like our seminarians went down to Cincinnati and that. So, but now we're back with our mother diocese, sharing a lot of those resources and ministries. Let's talk about those beginnings of how Youngstown became a diocese and how it became a diocese from Cleveland.
Surely. Well, as I thought about this, I wanted to use the vantage point of my work in pastoral planning and how was pastoral planning unfolding in a very different era. I think probably everyone's aware we're all one diocese beginning in 1847 and for almost a century until 1943. But one of the things that so impressed me was the role of lay leadership. Because when you look at the history of early parishes, you had Catholic people who were in many cases Irish Catholics coming to this area, and certainly German Catholics and other nationalities later. But they cherished their faith, and they realized we're better together. And so they began to come together and form communities, and then they would find a priest, or a priest would find them, and then communities began to grow. I know one story along that line that really impressed me was the work of Father Eugene O'Callaghan. I'm sure a number of people have heard about him, but I was so struck. He's a priest. He comes from Ireland. He goes to the University of Notre Dame to study priesthood, and then St. Mary's Seminary in our one diocese of Cleveland at the time. And when he's assigned to the cathedral, he helps to start a parish near the steel mills south of Cleveland, an area called Newburgh. And then he's moved to the Youngstown area, and he helps to build the parish of St. Columba, which later becomes the cathedral. And then I was struck in some of the stories. The people nearby, there was a community forming in Hubbard, and he was the only priest within 50 miles. And so he's helping in a number of communities, and so he helps to found St. Patrick's there. But then when under Bishop Gilmore in the 70s, he is moved from the eastern part of our then common diocese to St. Patrick's on the near west side of Cleveland. And it's a very bustling, densely populated area. So he's pastoring there, and the bishop says, well, we need another Irish parish. And so he begins to form St. Coleman's, which is immediately to the west. But what impresses me with all those places is worked at what was Holy Name, the parish by the mills. That's an anchor parish in the Slavic village area. St. Columba obviously becomes the cathedral. And St. Patrick's and St. Coleman's have a legacy of being anchors in their neighborhoods, deeply committed to the care of all the people, serving the poor, serving a number of social needs, as well as being vibrant worshiping communities. And it just strikes me as a remarkable legacy. Right. He probably had no idea what he was leaving behind that would be so vibrant to this day. You know, so that was one story that really struck me.
You know, it's interesting as you were talking about that. One thing that struck me is that, you know, in the beginning it was really Father Fenwick who came from the south and traveled into Ohio and subsequently up to Michigan and Wisconsin and all of that. But he really started the faith here in Ohio. And so one of the oldest parish in all northeastern Ohio is in our diocese in Dungannon.
Yes.
And which is a parish which continues today, small as it is. And so there's that sense that, you know, we are pilgrims on the way, like the early church was, but then we entrust our communities to those faithful who continue them, who build them up. And without the faithful, we really would not have our communities. And how important is it, and especially since Vatican II, that the laity are really involved in the lives of the church and the parishes? How important is that?
Yeah. Well, it's part of the foundation of how the church was built for 2,000 years, not only in our respective dioceses. And it's so important for the laity to believe that your gifts and your leadership and your stepping forward matters, pointing out pastoral needs, working together to form communities, to do outreach, to sustain Catholic education. Because sometimes we think, well, it must be a time of diminishment if we have fewer priests and we have to share a priest. But remember, all these growing communities for decades had to share a priest. Right. You know, we reached a time in the 50s and 60s that was kind of a very high point in terms of religious vocations, both the priesthood and religious life. And so we got used to several priests in some cases in one parish. Right. But when we share now, we're really going back to the way the foundation of how this diocese grew. People shared what they have, priests and other gifts, and they understood that, you know, that God is with us in all those moments.
Yeah, and I think in our last few minutes of our first segment, we want to let the folks know that when those things happen, those are not times to get worried or anxious, but they're times to really celebrate that that's how it all began. Yes. And we continue to be part of that. We continue to allow it to grow and to further and to flourish. What would be one thing that you would share with the folks that are with us about their involvement in parish life, especially in a parish that may not have a resident priest?
Right. Well, I think it's important, you know, we've learned, you know, since the implementation of the Second Vatican Council, there are so many, in a sense, structures that were created, parish pastoral councils, commissions, committees, whether it be to sustain adult faith formation or formation for children or community outreach or supporting the preparation for liturgy, that there's, in the work of social justice, there's so many opportunities. And I think the most important thing is to be aware of your gifts and your passion, because people do their best when they live what they most care about. It's not simply we need a body in these groups, but understand the gift that you have, what you most love to do, and find a way to do that in your parish. And it will make a tremendous difference.
We've got just a minute left before we take a break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about some of what you work with earlier on with the Diocese of Youngstown and Cleveland together, especially in your job as a pastoral planner. And so we'll share some more of that in a moment, but we're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. After the Catholics of Warren stopped meeting in their homes and organized a structured parish, they used a former Episcopalian church for their worship. St. Mary's Mission was established in 1837, yet the first resident pastor did not come to the parish until 1868. Other parishes quickly grew up in Trumbull County, including St. Stephen Niles in 1853, St. Patrick Hubbard in 1869, St. Vincent de Paul Vienna in 1871, now called St. Thomas the Apostle, and St. Rose Gerard in 1892. The other 15 parishes in the county were established after the turn of the 20th century. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future. In 1850, a Catholic mission was established in Conneaut, making it the first organized Catholic presence in Ashtabula County. It wouldn't be until 1864 that an actual building was purchased to serve St. Mary Church. 8 years before the construction of St. Mary's Parish Church, St. Joseph Church in the city of Ashtabula was established. Parishes in Conneaut have aligned under the title of Corpus Christi Parish, and in the city of Ashtabula as Our Lady of Peace Parish. There are 11 other parishes in that county that serve over 20,000 Catholics. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future. Welcome back to our show. I'm talking with Rick Krivanka from the Diocese of Cleveland. What I'd like us to talk about, Rick, is when you were in the pastoral planning office with the diocese, you shared some of your expertise with us here in the Diocese of Youngstown. I'd like you to kind of give us a little background as to what brought that on and how you really enriched our parishes with your presence.
Sure. Well, yeah, it was a tremendous honor to be invited. I think one of my first contacts, I began as director of pastoral planning in Cleveland in 1979. And I think it was in the early 1990s, I had the wonderful opportunity to work with you, and you were pastor at Immaculate Conception, and then Tom Eisworth was at Sacred Heart, and Ed Noga at St. Patrick's. And I think you were realizing something that we felt was so important, is that we're better together when we learn to realize we're one church together. We're not simply isolated and sometimes competitive communities. I think one of the challenges in Catholic life is sometimes parishes grew up and it was almost a competition who's bigger and better with certain sports teams or certain activities. But what we always have to remember, and this was something I find very inspiring, I heard a talk by a precious blood father, Father Clarence Williams, a number of years ago, and he made a comment. He said, Jesus taught us to pray the Our Father. We always think of that, the Lord's Prayer. But he said that was not Jesus' prayer. Jesus' prayer in the Gospel of John was, Father, that they may be one, as you and I are one. And I've often seen that as, if people were to say, what's pastoral planning about? It's responding to Jesus' prayer, that we might be one, as God wants us to be one. I think the whole movement of Jesus coming into the world is the unity of all creation, of all people. And I think there's a lot of forces at work that are working at times against that, but we obviously have to remember that's Jesus' prayer, our unity. So when we begin to come together, we grow a little more into that unity, whether it's 2 or 3 parishes or more parishes on a deanery level, whatever. We're more recognizing that we're interdependent with each other. And we have to look at what's the bigger world we collectively take care of rather than your place versus my place. And so I remember when we had those conversations, it grew out of an experience we were having in Cleveland. We had a major pastoral planning effort in the 1980s called the Urban Region Planning Process. It was specifically about Cleveland at the time. And we saw the tremendous demographic changes, very parallel to what happened in the city of Youngstown and other cities with out-migration, fewer resources. And one of the things we created as a way of looking at things back in the 80s is the importance of clusters, that we need to work together to talk about how can we better share resources. Every parish doesn't have to have one of everything. And what many people don't realize today, in some of the biggest dioceses in the country, for example, Boston, and I think Pittsburgh is moving into this, they're actually creating a parish cluster as a parish where a pastor has multiple parish sites, but they all work together as one team with, there might be a parochial vicar, other staff members, but that is now the leading edge of where people realize we need to go. And so you were very prophetic, you and Ed and Tom, realizing, wow, we've got to come together and find a better way to be the church.
And I think we've seen the fruits of that here in the Diocese of Youngstown. I think we still obviously have a ways to go. And like any kind of process, it does take time. It takes energy. It takes commitment and dedication to that. What would you say to those parishes that have a need to be more parochial, to be more on their own instead of looking at the bigger picture and being part of the broader, wider community, which is church?
Sure. Well, on one hand, I'm going to share a personal thing. I became a grandparent for the first time, my wife and I, Barbara, with our granddaughter Amelia, our first grandchild born in Colorado Springs, and on April 21st. And so it got me thinking. I have 4 young adult children, and I was thinking to myself about the journey of raising from infant into childhood and our own children. And one of the first things you teach your children, even at the youngest of ages, is you need to learn to share the world. I mean, that's what family life is. It's not just what I want. It's I need to be aware of what is my world and how do I share what I have with it. And so I think there is, on one hand, even from a human standpoint, aside from a church standpoint, we're called to be aware of what is the world that I'm a part of, the bigger community, and how do I learn to share what I have with those in need, to simply grow even more into that image I shared of Father, that they may be one, as you and I are one. And so this isn't something we do because we're running out of resources or because we're desperate. That's what God calls us to. That's what we teach our children. You know, we teach our children to learn, on one hand, to share within a family, and then in the wider world when they meet other children. And so it's part of what it means to be the best of what it means to be human, as well as Christian and Catholic. And it's a mindset. You know, I think it's important to realize I'm here for others. We have a wonderful image in the Jesuit tradition. It's often that was first Father Pedro Rupe, I think, first shared this image, and then it grew in different other ways. But we are men and women for others, not just for me or not just for my own. And we have to be thinking, what are the others God is calling me to in this time, in my neighborhood, in my area? It's always a call outward. Right. Jesus said, "Go and make disciples." He didn't say, "Go and make clubs." Go and make disciples. Go out into the world. So we have to keep translating. What does that mean for us in our area? That's a discernment that I think people have to figure out. And again, we need to do that with our other Catholic partners as well as partners of other Christian denominations and faiths. So it's an ever-widening circle. Right. That's what we are called to.
We have only 2 minutes left of our middle segment. So very briefly, how and why is parish life changing? Because it really is changing. In a nutshell, why is that?
Well, I think one of the most pivotal changes that is a great concern to me, and I would often say one of the greatest pastoral challenges we now face are young adults. Because what we're seeing, whether the young adults are from the absolute best of Catholic families, their parents truly did practice their faith in the best ways, they were loving parents, the nieces and nephews of priests and religious, I think what countless people are seeing is a disengagement, you know, in terms of marriages that are celebrated outside the church, not necessarily a choice to baptize children. And it's not because they didn't have great models. And I think that's a complicated issue. They're still wonderful young adults. I think they have great values. They have great care for the world. But I think we need to do everything we can to engage in a caring and kind and inviting manner every young adult we can to stay in the conversation. Sometimes it's just better understanding where they are and not in any way being negative or overly judgmental. But if you think about what's going to happen in 15, 20, 30 years from now, what will parish life look like without more young adults and young families coming into the church? I mean, it's a very challenging thought.
We're going to talk more about that in a moment, but we need to take another break. So stay with us. We'll be right back. In 1847, the parish of St. Columba was established. It would eventually become the cathedral church when the diocese was formed in 1943. It was the first parish in the city of Youngstown and in all Mahoning County. The first church built in 1851 was to be on land in Briar Hill that was donated by David Todd, who became the first and so far only governor from Mahoning County. A second church was built in 1864, and in 1897, the third church was erected on the site of the present cathedral. A tragic fire destroyed the cathedral in 1954, but by 1958, a new cathedral was dedicated, which serves Catholics today. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future.
My name is Sister Mary Claudina, and I run a home for abandoned children. I want to take care of children who have no parents, because luckily I come from a very loving family. There are 8 of us. We learn to care for each other, to love each other, to fight among each other, just to be a family. And I think that's what I learned from home, and I wanted to share that with children who do not have that opportunity.
The Catholic Diocese of Youngstown was established on May 15, 1943. 2018 marks the 75th anniversary of the diocese. There are 6 counties which make up the Diocese of Youngstown: Ashtabula, Columbiana, Mahoning, Portage, Stark, and Trumbull. There are 5 other dioceses in the state of Ohio, Cincinnati being the oldest, Cleveland, Youngstown's mother diocese, Columbus, Steubenville, and Toledo. Youngstown is the smallest in terms of area and the second smallest in terms of population, yet it has the 3rd highest percentage of people identifying themselves as Catholics. Congratulations, Catholic Diocese, for celebrating 75 years with pride in the past and faith in the future. Welcome back to our show. I'm talking with Rick Krivanka from the Jesuit Retreat House in Cleveland. We were talking about some of the important things that we need to look at as church, not only as diocesan church, but as the larger church. What are some of those other trends that we need to really be on top of in order to make our church truly the body of Christ?
Sure. I think one that stands out, and whether as we were talking about young adults or people of every age, that we really are places of wonderful welcome and hospitality. And I remember a wonderful quote by Father Robert Schreiter at the Catholic Theological Union at the time, and he made a comment that it's not simply the one-time welcome to someone, but it's the beginning of a relationship where they're continually welcomed. And I want to share a story that always strikes me around this topic. I had a very close friend who was a Lutheran pastor in Greenford in this area. And when he died of cancer tragically, he was very close to me. I think of him every time I receive communion when I think of the communion of saints. And anyway, his wife and children, young adult children, moved back to North Carolina. And I remember them going to a parish, and they were very excited. They looked around at different faith communities, and they found a Catholic parish that most inspired them. And I remember them saying, Catherine was saying, Rick, we're going to go into RCIA, and she was all excited. And I remember asking her sometime later how it was going. And she said, Rick, we would go there, and we would show up, and no one ever said anything to us. We'd go again, and then we were thinking, maybe no one talks to us because they think we're already members. And then we finally decided, I guess we're not welcome here, and they left. And so I think we all need to realize what a simple touch, a simple word of welcome, and even for people who are greeters, it's not like waiting for the people to come to you.
Right.
It's you going to the people.
Right.
It's like you're greeting them. And we all need to be thinking, are we making everyone who comes here feel welcome? No one ever says, I don't want to feel welcome. I've never heard that. And so that's one aspect. I think the other big trend, and this is in so much of the research on why people may leave for another denomination, is how important inspiring homilies are and meaningful worship. That is foundational to the church. We are a church built on the celebration of the Eucharist, and we have to realize we so need to do our best whenever we celebrate the Eucharist in terms of homilies that really speak to everyday living and a liturgy that really engages people in giving praise to God, and really as a community of people who really share that sense of shared celebration.
And I think I'd like us to now talk about how leadership can best bring that about and encourage that and really be supportive of all of that. We have been very fortunate in our diocese, both in Cleveland and Youngstown, to have very committed diocesan ordinaries and leaders. Talk about some of those from Cleveland and perhaps how you would have experienced some of the leadership here in Youngstown.
Sure. One of the things that struck me, first of all, I'm speaking, please know Bishop Murray's in our prayers. I find a striking parallel between our present bishops, Bishop Murray and Bishop Perez, that I think they really bring a joyful spirit to pastoral leadership. And as Pope Francis has said, joy is really important, the joy of the gospel and how we give witness to that. But one of the things that struck me is the great honor given to bishops in relatively recent times in our diocese. I'm not sure if people are aware that when Bishop Malone was an auxiliary bishop, he went to the Second Vatican Council, all 4 sessions.
Right.
And later on, when he was Bishop of Youngstown, he received what I thought was a tremendous honor. In 1983 to 1986, he was elected, I think it was when the National Conference of Catholic Bishops had been formed, he was elected by his brother bishops to lead the national bishops. There's over 180 dioceses in the country. And so he was also the first bishop to be chosen rather than a cardinal or an archbishop. And so I think it was a wonderful sense of well, how do brother bishops see one of our bishops? And then going to the Cleveland side, in 1995 to 1998, Bishop Pilla, 10 years later, was discerned to be the president of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. And I think it's just a great honor that we had bishops, that bishops throughout the country felt were some of the best bishops in the country. And so that's why they elected them.
Let's, in our last few minutes of our time together, talk about that whole sense of inspiration, because there are people that inspire us to do what we do. I look at my own life, there are priests that really mentored me and encouraged me to look at priesthood as a vocation. And I'm sure your work over these many years and decades in the church is because of some inspiration in your life. Talk about some of those people who have inspired you and what they've given you to help you do what you do.
Well, it begins with my parents, and I know their grandparents. They were people of deep faith. I happen to be first generation Slovak. My name is actually from a mountain in Slovakia called Mount Krivan in the High Tatras, and I remember my father talking about how my mother would walk and hike to Poland to a particular shrine there. But I know they were tremendous. And you could not be a Krivanka without being Catholic. It was just who you were. But then I had an uncle who was a priest in the Diocese of Toledo, and he was a great inspiration. I was influenced by religious orders in the school I went to, a marist school. And I was invited, actually, I was being recruited to become a priest, to be a marist father. I was very close to the Blessed Sacrament Fathers, and I think all of that calling lives in my life. Now as the director of Jesuit Retreat House, and in many ways I'm like a pastor of the ministry of that house. And it means a tremendous amount to me, because part of the essence of Jesuit Retreat House is to help people find what has the deepest meaning, the deepest sense of right direction, the deepest sense of finding God in their life. That's why people come there, and it's almost like my whole life has made this full circle. While I loved all my pastoral planning work, I feel that my whole life led to be executive director. The other thing I always find that's important to an inspiration is the importance of emotion. There's a wonderful comment that St. Ignatius makes when he talks about spiritual direction, and he says, it is not so much knowledge, but the inner feeling that fills and satisfies the soul. And I think one of the things we need to be so attentive to as parents and pastors, as leaders in different ways, to the emotion that's happening. Sure. What's the deeper emotion that whatever we're doing or saying is evoking in people's lives? And one of my further reflections on that is I'm a believer that every conversation is sacred. Every one. This one, the ones we have with family members, the ones we have with total strangers, because every conversation, every one, can leave people with a little more life and a little more hope. So I would say to all of our listeners, whoever you're talking with in every moment, and also in a special way with young adults, as I spoke earlier, be deeply aware of, do my conversations leave people with a little more life and a little more hope? Because I think that's at the core of bringing God's love into our world.
Well, Rick, thank you so much for being with us and for your presence on the show, for enlightening us from the Diocese of Cleveland, but also your work with the Jesuit Retreat House there in Cleveland. We thank you for that, and God bless you in your work and your ministry.
Thanks so much. A great honor.
And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Spotlight has been a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father James Korda.